There was a detailed study done by Princeton University in conjunction with Northwestern University in our country. The study indicated was, and it said they studied 20 years of laws, regulations passed in Washington, D.C. The conclusion of the study was that we lived in an oligarchy administered by or run by a moneyed elite. Several years later after that, there was an FBI memo that mentioned this seventh floor group that basically runs the country. It was leaked, and it was subsequently called the deep state. So the question is always in any system, who's running the system really?
Very welcome to the Herland Report. John Whitehead, you are a constitutional attorney here in the United States and the president and founder of the Rutherford Institute, in which you examine many of the issues that are dire to the American society today, as we see a divisiveness that we didn't used to see before. And you have an award-winning book, A Government of Wolves, which is a brutal critique of how the American system and society has developed further and further away from the constitutional freedoms.
The Constitution as originally written, many of the people in the country at the time objected to it because it did not have a Bill of Rights. It was mainly a structure of government. And some were afraid that the way the government was established, that the president would have too much power in the central government, and the states were worried about that. So there were a number of people in the country that said we have to have a Bill of Rights or we will not ratify or agree to the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson was one of them, by the way, and who wrote the Declaration of Independence, in which he said that our rights are there when we're born. They're automatically there. We just inherit those rights. They're God-given. That's basically what he says. We were created with certain basically rights that the government cannot take away. And the purpose of government is to protect those rights. And so we need a Bill of Rights. And so that was added. They were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They were added. And those basically form the rights that we have as citizens in the country. Unfortunately, as I see today, and children coming out of our state-run public schools, financed public schools, colleges and law schools, I mean, used to when I would talk to people, you go back 30 years ago, they had a good idea what was in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. They have basically, I have law students today that can't tell me the 5 freedoms in our First Amendment, which are, the right to free speech, the right to assemble and protest against the government, the right to religion, and down the line, and a government that's free of establishing a religion. I mean, you're talking to people who are going to law school at Harvard today, and the big schools that have trouble telling us what the freedoms are anymore. They don't teach them.
And this is why we say, coming from Europe and living in this time and age, that the American Constitution must have been the greatest constitution. When you look at, for example, the right to riot against...
Yes, as long as it's peaceful, yeah. Peaceful assembly.
And also the right to disagree with the president.
Go to hell if you want to, put it that way. Without being arrested.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was born and raised in Africa and have lived in the Middle East for many years, in South America. I mean, you don't see those kind of rights around.
Yeah. And they're there. I mean, like I said, Jefferson, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, said that we inherit those from the beginning. There's a creator, it's created. They're in nature. There are rights. But they need to be spelled out because, unfortunately, government will overstep those rights. They do it continually. And so why we have a Bill of Rights, there's a right in the Second Amendment, the right to own a firearm. And the reason that's in the Bill of Rights is that, as George Washington said, he said, do not have a standing army on American soil. We face that. And the only way to protect against it is a weapon. George Orwell, the great writer, said that the rifle over the working man's cottage is a symbol of freedom. That's an actual quote from George Orwell. He saw that. The man who wrote 1984 and predicted all the things that we're seeing happening today. But the Third Amendment says in our Constitution, you can't quarter soldiers in Americans' homes. You can't send the military in people's homes. We're seeing that today. All these are being broken today with the SWAT team raids we're seeing happening. And probably, I would say the most important amendment we have is our so-called Fourth Amendment, which is the right against unreasonable search and seizure by the government. They can't just grab you. They can't search you on the streets and those things. But routinely, policemen are doing them today. We have a big lawsuit that I filed just recently where this last August, they put 700 policemen surround the city. It was there have been riots the year before. And people entering the downtown complex, they were searched and all this and that. Well, we had a disabled veteran in his late 60s who went into a store. He brought 2 pistols in. It was okay to carry guns on the mall, but you couldn't buy air spray or anything that might be something people could use in a riot. He bought Arizona tea, which is in a can. He was searched and arrested and thrown in a police car and cut up. This is a 64-year-old war veteran on a walker. But again, we're arguing that that was an unreasonable search and seizure. You don't grab somebody in America, search their bags, and throw them in a police car like that. So, there are key freedoms in that amendment, but what I'm afraid I'm seeing today, and I'll say it with Americans, is generally Americans, I talk to policemen, by the way, that have trouble, and our government officials that can't articulate what's in the Constitution. And politicians, by the way, running for office, they have one of the worst scores when they're tested on what's in the Constitution. So you have a people in America that's grown ignorant of the Constitution. And ignorance is, to me, sliding down a very dangerous hill. And I'm trying to wake Americans up and say, listen, well, Government of Wolves, the title comes from that book, is Edward R. Murrow's favorite quote. He was a great early 1950s commentator. He said, a nation of sheep begets a government of wolves. In other words, a nation of sheep is the people who go, they fall asleep watching the TV set, which he was worried about at the time, or their screen devices, and they're not paying attention to what's happening in the country. And Jefferson said it best. He said, eternal vigilance by the citizens is how we keep freedom. You have to stay awake. And as I often say, your eyes are useless if your mind's asleep. Your eyes don't work anymore. We need to keep our minds vibrant. And I thought that's what our educational system was designed to do in this country. Unfortunately, the educational system's not doing that. And so you're finding more and more people who have no clue about their basic rights and stuff that which used to be taught very firmly in our schools.
When you look at the rise and fall of civilizations, you see that at the height of a civilization, yes, there comes this arrogance. For example, say the Roman Empire, and then they change the value system. Yeah. There's amendment of laws, and precisely those laws were the laws that were foundational for the success of that particular civilization. Yeah. And then you have the entry of the privatization of armies, the re-entry of slavery, the re-entry of a number of elements in society that pushes that society towards anarchy. And of course, that's the worry for us who love America. Yes. That's our deep, deep worry, because you also rule Europe on many accounts.
Exactly. We have 1,000 bases, military bases plus, spread around in 177 countries around the world, just like Rome. And unfortunately, Rome collapsed for a number of reasons. One was the citizens went to sleep, and they spread their finances. I mean, our country today is trillions of dollars in debt, and most people don't realize that. It's struggling, and people are overtaxed. Americans pay more in taxes than they do for food and housing in this country. But what do you have? You have Jeff Bezos, who runs Amazon, who didn't pay any federal income tax last year. There's just a rich class that seems to float by. And Americans should be outraged by that. But like I say, most Americans are asleep. They don't know their rights. They don't know what's going on in society generally. They're too busy, worried about what's happening on Facebook to figure out. And again, go back to what Jefferson said, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, eternal vigilance, stay awake, people. And this is a lesson for people in Europe. Know what your government's doing, always. And in this country, this is the interesting thing about us. The Constitution's first 3 words says, we the people do establish this country. I keep emphasizing to people is, we are the government. The people in Washington, D.C. are supposed to be working for us. That policeman on the street who routinely now grabs people, Young people even smashes them face down the sidewalk. We see it all the time in America. Or shoots kids or tasers them while they're laying on the ground. These are 11 and 12-year-old girls. These are things that we have to understand is that the police are supposed to be working for us. They're not supposed to be doing that kind of stuff. Again, I want to go back to our Fourth Amendment. It says unreasonable search and seizure. The police are not supposed to be grabbing us on the street and saying, "What are you doing here?" You know, this is supposedly what? A free country, quote unquote. But we're not seeing today. You have people, the police in this country are shooting 1,000+ citizens every year. Many of them haven't done anything. They're just shooting them. They're nervous today. They're trained in what's called the worst scenario. When they see you, they're afraid of you. Bang, they shoot you. And again, they're shooting young people and women today, which when I was growing up in the 1960s, that would have been an outrage. Now it's considered, oh no, and someone else got shot today, and people just walk off.
What I find very interesting with your writing also is that us Europeans, we come from the angle, we're closer, much closer to the Middle East. So when we look at the American military complex, we think about the wars abroad, the war in Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, all of that. But you're writing that there's a war on the American people and the militarization of America domestically.
Oh yes, we have the militarized police today. And again, they're ignoring the Constitution. In the early 1980s, there were 3,000 SWAT team raids. These are militarized, they're in military gear, they have all kinds of equipment, they're ready to go. And they're smashing through doors in the middle of the night, people are getting killed and all this and that. But it's something that's just zoomed ahead here because the federal government, our controlling national government, has given the police all this equipment. And they're using it. And like I said, kids are getting shot. They shoot sometimes up to 500 dogs a day.
I think around 1980, annually there were 3,000 SWAT team raids in the US. Now annually, approximately 80,000.
That's all documented, by the way.
That's an amazing rise.
Well, you saw it with Roger Stone's arrest when they arrested him. 29 armed agents and 17 vehicles to have a guy who didn't own a gun. But we see that happening all the time in America now. I mean, what police used to do in this country, 2 policemen would show up at your door and knock on your door. They had a warrant and say, "You're the person we need to, take you into custody, or you need to show up to court." Now they just send the SWAT team right. They just go through the doors. But again, that goes back to our Bill of Rights. If you read the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights says, no, you can't do that. The Fourth Amendment says you can't enter by anybody's property unless you have a real strong legal reason to do it. You can't go through, but they used to have to knock on the door. Like I said, when I was growing up in the 1960s, if a policeman just shot somebody by accident, it was considered a scandal. Today, it's people just shrug and move on. They've been acclimated to it. And again, going back to what we were originally saying, that goes to people's understanding of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, all these rights they have. And I mean, the powers that the government has today are not powers that the people who wrote the Constitution gave them. They're powers that they have illegitimately, in my opinion, taken and assumed, like the power to crash through your door in the middle of the night. And they always do it in the middle of the night because why they do it at 3 a.m. in the morning is you're disoriented. And see, what happens is an older man wakes up and he hears, he gets up and grabs his umbrella, ready to fight. The police say they think it's a rifle, so they shoot him dead. But it's a mistake. It's okay these days. It's called qualified immunity. In this country, the police have qualified immunity almost 99% of the time. That means that they can't be prosecuted. They go back to work. If I did the same thing, I'd be in prison.
But what is the reason for this development? I mean, we live in a globalized society today that depends on an international economic system that departs from the nation-based capitalist system. It's dependent on open borders and a different kind of workings than what we saw the founding principles in the Constitution to be. Some say we're entering into a system in the West of dictatorship, economic dictatorship.
It's totalitarianism. I call it, we live in a total surveillance state, and what I'm seeing, again, you're talking to somebody, I've been in this area 40 years practicing constitutional law. I've sued the president, won the case. I've done all kinds of litigation across the country against police. And a lot of the police in this country do not like me or disagree with me. Some do. The older policemen in this country are concerned about the way things are going. But there's a paranoia in government. They feel, in my opinion, a lot of agents that, well, they're very nervous about citizens getting up and, like, we're going to march in the streets. They don't like that. There's a nervous. There's a paranoia. And how it's, by the way, displayed, and I've talked about this in my writings, the Pentagon put out a video several years ago where they're predicting, it's a training video. It was actually produced and directed by a Hollywood director who remains anonymous. He's predicting total chaos by 2030. The country's going to break down financially. It's already broken down morally and otherwise in this country. And they're predicting that they're going to have to impose martial law at that point. And it may be headed the direction, like I say, as an American here, when I'm seeing the large corporations like Sears and Roebuck, they're all going out of business. Malls are closing up in this country as Amazon has taken over a great amount of the business and traffic. And other things are happening. People are going to be out of work. It's going to be very, very difficult to survive. I can see people getting upset, but the government's extremely paranoid. And we can go into, later and talk about other ways that they're paranoid, but they're watching everything people do these days. They actually have a list that's called Main Core. It has 8 million names. They admit it in this country that will be rounded up in times of distress. They'll come get you. In other words, they know where you're at. This is not conspiracy theory. They admit they have this list. At least 8 million names are on this list.
What I find interesting also about the American Constitution is that it follows the principle of the French philosopher Montesquieu, that in order to have a well-functioning democracy, you do have to have the separation of powers. Mm-hmm. The judicial, the executive, and the legislative has to be separate entities. And he argues and says, which is the same that you find in the American Constitution, that the difference between a democracy and a totalitarian system or an autocratic system is that in a democracy, these three are separated, but in a totalitarian, or you may say, in addition, also, of course, in dictatorships, all those three work together as one, creating a lot of fear amongst all of those who work within those branches too. And we see those tendencies in Europe. In my country, in Norway, for example, the judicial branch, they're afraid to give any ruling that is contradictory to the liberal progressive political agenda. And the people that work in the media, for example, are very afraid. Many journalists openly say they are afraid of writing anything that is contradictory to the liberal progressive media, the narrative, because if they do, they stand in danger of losing their jobs. We have the same at the universities, the professors at the universities. So I don't know, I guess we're much more socialist than you. I don't know if we've come further into this kind of system. But for sure, when you lose that separation of powers, you're entering into another phase.
Yes, there was a detailed study done by Princeton University in conjunction with Northwestern University in our country, and it was issued in 2014, but what the study indicated was, and it said they studied 20 years of laws, regulations passed in Washington, D.C. The conclusion of the study was that we lived in an oligarchy administered by or run by a moneyed elite. Several years later after that, there was an FBI memo that mentioned this seventh floor group that basically runs the country. It was leaked. And it was subsequently called the deep state. So the question is always in any system, who's running the system really? In this country, if you see the Pelosi's, whoever, the president, Donald Trump, whatever, they're all very, very moneyed people. They have lots of money. The people who run for the Senate a lot of times are people who have lots of money. And eventually when they get in, they become millionaires. In fact, in this town, Washington, D.C., the congressman here spends several days a week raising money. Again, the American taxpayers are paying for this to run for the next election. And they go after moneyed clients. So Basically, money in most governments calls the shots, that I would say. In America, it does as well. The unions, for example, the police unions in this country are very, very strong. If you take any kind of action against the police, it's very difficult to sustain unless you're a constitutional lawyer in court fighting it continually. The average American doesn't have any of that. And so what you have, and Jimmy Carter in an interview about a year and a half ago actually blurted out, we live in an oligarchy, he said, not a democracy or a republic run by people with money. This is the former president saying this. So if money's calling the shots always, freedoms are going to wane. The people who I've defended over the years, good people like Martin Luther King, some of the great freedom fighters in our country, they either end up getting shot, they were striving for money, they didn't have a lot of money. And many of the people I've defended that are freedom fighters, they're not of that class. They just want people to have freedom. Well, first of all, they want people to think. They want people to think about what's happening in their world. The problem with the educational system today, however, it dumbs down thinking. With the elimination of words and thoughts that we're seeing, people are becoming very non-debate. And debate is the key to freedom, in my opinion.
So are we watching a shutdown of democracy?
Yes, we are.
Thank you very much, John Whitehead, for coming here to the Herland Report, president of the Rutherford Institute, and for everyone to follow your webpage and follow your work on the militarization of America. Thank you.
Thank you.